Welcome to the Shift podcast. This podcast was recorded on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. The creators of this podcast recognize that we are all treaty people and we accept our collective responsibility to each other and to reconciliation as we work towards an equitable, inclusive, and accessible campus for all. On the Shift podcast, facilitated by Student Affairs, you will hear from students of diverse backgrounds about their lived experiences at Queen's, how these experiences are shaped by identity, their visions for a safer and more inclusive campus climate, and what needs to happen for there to be a meaningful and lasting culture shift. Today, we'll be hearing from Chad and Rohan.
I always sort of knew that I didn't really fit in too well with cis heteronormative society.
The way she brings intersectionality into the class has just been so amazing to experience because I feel like I can actually share my personal experiences and stories in the class, and that's been a game changer.
My struggles at Queen's were not just as a queer person, but also as an international student. Just the basic struggles of finding housing, understanding, and just adjusting myself like culturally and socially.
Please note that this episode of the Shift podcast will feature Queen's students' experiences and perceptions of campus safety, incidents of harassment, homophobia, and transphobia. These are difficult topics. If you feel overwhelmed at any point while listening to this podcast or reflecting on it later, pay attention to your needs. There are resources to support you. Visit the Queen's Student Wellness website for more information.
Hi everyone, my name is Chad. My pronouns are he, him, they, them. I'm in my third year of the commerce program, and I'm originally from Surrey, British Columbia. Very excited to be here today to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll pass it off to Rohan.
Hi, thank you, Chad. My name is Rohan. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm an international grad student doing a master's in computing. And I'm originally from Bangladesh. I just moved to Canada here in the fall of 2021. And currently I'm researching things including AI ethics and fairness and working towards making technology more safer, more inclusive to queer folk. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm excited to share my story with you all.
All right, well, let's get started. I think this is always a really interesting topic for me. I think equity, diversity, and inclusion is something I've been very involved in my role as co-chair for Q+. Rohan, I think let's start off by talking about our decision to actually come to Queens. But for me, I grew up in Surrey, so a pretty small suburban town. I also really wanted to escape from that city as well, and so I think the natural choice was to come to Ontario, take a 3-hour train to Kingston, and come study here at Queen's. And so part of that decision was because of the program's reputation, but also I wanted to explore a new environment as well. And so those are two of my major factors when choosing university.
That's awesome. I also sort of came to Queens in a sort of was motivated by a desire to kind of get out of from where I was. Um, I guess I should probably just start with why I came to Canada first. And part of the reason was there were a lot better research opportunities here, and I kind of wanted to pursue research. And I just happened to find a really good fit in my supervisor doing the kind of research into AI-based ethics and fairness that I was really interested in. And that's particularly how I ended up diverting to Queens. But I was also really motivated to kind of get out of home because Bangladesh is where I'm from. It's quite a conservative Muslim country, and it can be very hostile for the LGBTQ plus community. I was closeted pretty much all of my life, and I wanted to sort of come to a place where I could be a little bit more free and express myself. So yeah, that's why I'm in Canada, and that's why I'm at Queens. So I guess on that note, Chad, do you want to talk a little bit about our personal journeys into how we sort of discovered ourselves?
Yeah, for sure. I think my coming out journey happened mainly at Queens, actually. I think Queens has really helped me with that, and especially the people that I've kind of surrounded myself with. I recall my experience in first year when I became friends with someone who was also a part of the queer community, and they came out to me first. So I felt very safe at that moment. And so eventually I also came out to them. And that was kind of the first time that I started accepting my identity. It was in first year. Um, and after first year, I really wanted to get involved as well in the queer space because I was still very much, um, I would still say I was in the closet at that time, even though I came out to some people. It felt like I had some internalized homophobia for sure. So I wanted to get involved in the queer space, and I joined Q Plus as logistics and socials coordinator. For those who don't know, Q Plus is the professional development committee under the Commerce Society, and our mission is to empower queer folks to be able to pursue the careers that they want. And our mission has mainly predominantly been targeted at business students, but we're really hoping to expand that outside as well very soon. So I plan a lot of socials there. I really got to meet a variety of different people who identified all across, the queer community. And I think that was just a great opportunity for me to become more confident in my identity. And ultimately, leading the club has really helped me do that because I've become someone who is the face of the club and ultimately um, really just pushing myself out of my comfort zone to gain that confidence. And that's been really reassuring to me.
I can't imagine like the challenges you'd have to face to lead a queer organization and just really put yourself out there. It's a it's an entirely different thing. Um, I guess I'll get into a little bit of my story as well. I came out, I guess, initially just to, I'll start with coming out to myself, really. Yeah, I came out around like 2020, but even before then, it was a case of something where I always sort of knew where that I didn't really fit in too well with cis heteronormative society. I grew up in a very, very male socialized upbringing, and I, as a result, really had a lot of internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia from a very young age. And a lot of that got sort of, really directed as self-hatred. And over my teenage years, I was really like, I felt very anxious. I did not feel like I really fit in too well. And I and I didn't really have any access to like queer friends or anybody who could really sort of, in a way, sort of tell me what was up, you know? And I it wasn't until I did my undergrad and I became friends with somebody who was openly bisexual. And then I was like, huh, well, that's a something. And then once I was comfortable with that, I was like, it started to make sense that I could question my own bisexuality a little bit and kind of realize that, you know what, maybe I am not a cishet man. And sort of like just my journey since then of like discovery and learning, and the pandemic in a way gave me the chance to sort of like just sit down and reflect and learn about things initially from a Western point of view. And then eventually I learned more about like how much gender nonconformity is rooted into South Asian culture. And once I learned the language of non-binary, it just felt right. It just felt like it fit. And initially, I came out to my then girlfriend, now spouse, who has been incredibly supportive. But I couldn't come out to too many people. I came out to some close friends, and some I was met with some very harsh words, and then I learned pretty quickly that you can't trust everybody once you're queer. So that's sort of how I came up, and I guess that leads to how my journey has been since coming to Queens. Chad, you already touched on this a little bit, but do you want to go into a bit more detail about how Queens has particularly treated you?
Yeah, for sure. I think when I reflect on my past experience and also my current experience at Queens, I think it has very much um, been a really important factor in how I view myself. So I kind of touched on how, my first friend at Queens, who I came out to and also came out to me, really helped me with my identity. And that was like that first initial step that I took. In terms of, how my identity has kind of played into a role in my experience here, I would say that it's played a humongous role, I think. So being someone who's queer and also Asian, I've kind of adopted that sort of mindset whenever I approach like a problem or of some sort. I kind of try to think with an intersectional mindset, and I try to think about the perspectives of others as well. And that's especially, I think, prominent in the work that I've done with Q Plus. So, for example, with our mentorship program and with our events, making that as accessible as possible, uh, making that also very much intersectional. So, including people of all different backgrounds, not just cis white queer folks, but also people who identify as non binary, as genderqueer, and more. And so that has been how my identity has shaped my experience here at Queens. Would love to hear about your experience as well, because I think there's definitely a lot of common ground that queer folks experience, but also a lot of differences as well.
Yeah, a very interesting thing you brought up, like of intersectionality and just being not only a queer person but also a person of color, and how that sort of changes like your experience. Like I can definitely relate. Like my struggles at Queens were not initially not just as a queer person but also as an international student. Like it, initially it was hard when I first got here. You know, just the basic struggles of finding housing, understanding many ways Canada work, and just adjusting myself like culturally and socially. Like that was a bit of a hurdle, and trying to navigate that while also kind of trying to explore myself as a queer person, as a non-binary person. It was initially it was a very quite challenging, and I've had a mix of like both positive and negative experiences. I think now I can kind of reflect on it and say there's definitely been more positive than negative. I've definitely had some really good experiences with very good people, but it also doesn't change the fact that I also did have to struggle quite a bit. Um, in general, just coming here, I'm personally in a very cishet dominated department. I'm one of the only people who really use they them pronouns, and it's it's a big hurdle for a lot of people. And one particular thing, I guess, is that grad program, the makeup is very different from, I suppose, an undergrad program. Especially I think in the computing department, it's very diverse, and there's people from lots of different backgrounds, and this is not meant to really throw shade at anyone, but when you have people from lots of different places coming about, you have to always remember that the advances in how much I think like West, like here in Canada, people have like learned over the last 5 years regarding things like non-binary gender, for example. Like not the whole world, like the whole world has not sort of done the same in some of these aspects, and therefore when you're dealing with people from so many different backgrounds, you always have to keep this in mind that not everybody is malicious. It's just that some people are uninformed, and you always have to give them that sort of leeway. And I feel like that creates a unique challenge in being an international grad student here. So I've definitely had a couple of very difficult people, either to directly me dealing with them or through some of my friends really got like, at least I'm not surprised, whenever I hear something that's slightly problematic, but I know that once my sort of cishet friends became allies, uh, then they started getting really surprised at like the things that their friends are saying. And then they're coming back to me like, so I know this person said this. And I'm like, yes, that's what most people say about us. Definitely there has been difficulties. But I'm glad that I'm around like enough supportive people who make my identity feel like, who make myself, I sort of feel loved, and who really support me and don't expect me to explain myself. And having that support circle really helps, I think, adjust. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I definitely, that sounds like it's a very difficult time for sure, especially because you're not, you weren't born in Canada, you didn't grow up here. So you also had kind of like a culture shock,
Mhm.
having to find housing, having to find a sense of community here in a whole
Yeah.
new country,
Yes.
that's honestly like insane. And as a domestic student, that's something that I can't relate with, but I can definitely empathize incredibly. There are a lot of international students here in commerce, and a lot of them don't feel as included sometimes because
Mhm.
they might have an accent or they can't land that internship interview as opposed to like a domestic candidate can because they're from not from Canada, they're from a country outside. But I'm really glad to hear that you've had a lot of support here as well. And I think that kind of moves on to our next topic, which is our own support network here at Queens. For me, it's definitely my friends and also my queer club that I've been able to connect with a lot of people with. For example, beyond just students, I think, especially with some of the Smith administration, it's been really great to connect with them. I think in particular, Nancy Salmon. Nancy is the one of the administration members of the Career Advancement Center, and she is based out of the Toronto office, I believe. I've never actually met Nancy in person, but we connected virtually, throughout the pandemic, and that's been super awesome. But she supports the Career Center and also firms and creating relationships with student clubs. And so everything relating to career, she's part of that department at Smith. She's always reaching out to us, like making sure that we're doing okay, asking how she can help amplify our message and mission. And that's something that's really like stood out to me. And I think that's something that Queens as a school should implement more of. Making sure that student engagement and student equity clubs are well supported is super important as well. I'd love to hear about some of your experiences as well when it comes to feeling
Yeah.
supported here at Queens and your support network.
Yeah. It's amazing really having uh somebody like to really provide that support, like somebody from an administrative level. Like I personally, I feel like for me, throughout my engagements with Yellow House, like people like Kel Martin, Elliot Chappelle, who are just there to like really provide resources for equity, diversity, inclusion, inclusive purposes. Like they're just so amazing, like at pretty much everything I've reached out to them for. Like there's definitely been some incredibly supportive people here at Queens. um like I cannot say enough nice things about them. And a lot like you, I would say my queer friends here are absolutely amazing. Like people who are like, not, I'm not just talking about like, white queer people, but also like people, the different people of color. They're all so incredibly incredible and welcoming. And it's, I don't know how you feel about this particular thing, but I always feel like whenever I meet somebody else who's also queer and a person of color, uh, and like it's like we just instantly get each other on like on first meeting, and like
Yep.
there's like an instant connection, like we just understand.
Yeah, and I think that's why initiatives like the Yellow House are so important. So what kind of events have you been to the Yale House?
Yeah, so the Yellow House is equity, diversity, inclusivity initiative here at Queens, and they do a lot of work, particularly for queer people and queer people of color. And it's I for one example would be that they're doing a solidarity swim, which is open only to people who are under the trans umbrella and their close seconds. And it's just incredible. Like I haven't been to the first one, but like I've just heard so many incredible things about it that people are normally, people under the trans umbrella, we kind of feel really excluded from spaces such as like swimming. Like, and it's normally it's a really experience of anxiety, and just to break that down and be like and create a space exclusively for trans people there, it was absolutely like an incredible thing. And I've heard somebody say like, I've never seen so many happy trans people in one place. And
That's
that's like
awesome.
one, yeah, it's one incredible initiative of Yellow House. There is there's the Sunday Supper series that they do. It's an incredible education series where like everybody is welcome and people can come and learn about issues facing queer people here at Queens, and it's just incredible.
And that
Yeah.
kind of ties into like my next point are something that I hope to discuss, which is kind of the personal and also systemic issues at Queens here when it comes to EDII. I think, you know, when it comes to the paid efforts and also student time, students aren't always compensated when it comes to equity work, even though you're pretty much doing what the administration should kind of be doing in fostering community and inclusivity. I think it's always very interesting when Queens highlights, the queer clubs here at Queens, the queer clubs, during June or also during admission season. But then afterwards, it kind of dwindles down, and the support isn't really there, especially um, financially. And I think something to kind of abide by is, you should put your money where you talk, right? Or,
Mhm.
or
Very
on what
much
you
so.
say. And so I think that's one area that Queens could definitely improve in. And it's something that I hope to advocate for next year, which is paid positions, especially under the Commerce Society when in regards to equity. But what are some of like the personal or systemic issues that you've kind of experienced here at
Yeah,
Queens?
it's something really interesting like that I only learned like after talking to you, that just how much of like the equity clubs here are basically running on volunteer labor. And it's sort of like I think a culture that really needs to change, because equity clubs are specifically there to like make the student experience better for everyone involved, and to sort of address the needs of marginalized communities that are not being heard otherwise. And to expect like just volunteers to put their own like put like hours and hours, that such as what you're doing of your own time, like into this work, just without really anything to show for it. I think it's not really fair on anybody. Like I think the Yellow House is like a primary example of like what can happen when you do put funding towards these initiatives, right? And I definitely feel like it's sort of what's holding back a lot of the equity clubs here. And there definitely needs to be a culture shift on that. I mean, we can't really speak for everybody. Like there's within the EDI space, like I know there's different unique challenges being faced by people of the indigenous communities, and for example. But I mean, I personally um def- definitely like I personally feel, at least within my space, which is specifically grad school, like I feel like it is a difficult time for queer people to sort of present our ideas like in a way, because whenever you are presenting any idea, putting forward to someone in the department, it's usually uh, obviously you have to be judged based on your peers work. And usually the problems that we tend to talk about, the problems that we are concerned with, are usually not shared with like normally with cishet people. And therefore it's kind of difficult to really raise some of the issues uh, when people are not particularly receptive to it. And I don't mean that people really mean this with ill intent. It's just that a lot of these issues are kind of new, and they're new to them, at least, like not something that's typically brought up. And I can give like an example of this. um, I was recently working on with some research about how AI-based language technologies are particularly discriminative to people who identify outside the gender binary. And bringing this up to in front of people, usually you can kind of tell that people are not expecting to hear this when you want to present research on AI technology. And so therefore, I always implicitly feel like there is a resistance to it, but I can't like there's also been support. So I'm not saying like it's only bad, but definitely there's some problems in like raising up issues like this to a platform. Um, for another example would be conferences, right? It's very difficult for queer people to really be present at conferences, because our work is getting reviewed by usually cishet people. Definitely there are a lot of challenges that we need to tackle on a personal and systemic level. And I suppose, I mean, it's a very complicated question, right? Like what can we do to really improve things? Like what is your opinion? Like are some areas of improvement out there.
Yeah, I think when it comes to improving the space right now, a lot of it has to do with funding, I think, at the end of the day. I've noticed over time that with Q Plus, with Equip, which is the education project under the AMS, and they do a lot of events, socials on queer issues as well as NG queers. I've noticed that over time, engagement rates and also the number of people who apply for these positions have decreased over time because honestly, a lot of people are burnt out from doing equity work. I read somewhere on LinkedIn actually that like 80% or like 75 to 80% of EDI officers or executives feel burnt out. And I think that's because a lot of the pushback and also lack of support and always, having to make a business case when you have some sort of initiative that you want to put forward. You have to kind of make your argument palatable to
Yeah.
your the people in power who are cishet people, and it's difficult, it's super challenging, and experiencing pushback makes you less motivated, and then not having that funding to be compensated for your time kind of makes you less motivated to work even harder on the initiatives that you are working on because you become burnt out, right? A lot of your time is like allocated towards trying to actually self-care as well, and that's something that actually isn't talked a lot about when it comes to solutions. I think one particular thing that I've noticed is so on top of just paid positions, the number of queer clubs at Queens has only grown since 2020. I think right now there are 18 clubs or so. And so something that my first year representatives and I, shout out to them, we have actually started working on a new initiative called Queers at Queens, which is a one-stop shop Instagram account where you can find all your queer news and events. So we hopefully so if people follow that one page, they can get access to all the different initiatives happening at Queen's University and Kingston. So hopefully by following that one account, they can get access to all their initiatives and queer events and initiatives here in Kingston. So engagement rate increases and people feel like their work is paying off, because at the end of the day, that's what really matters, I think, is making sure that their efforts are recognized through attendance rates, etc. But yeah, I think that's one thing. It's centralizing these movements and initiatives. It's incredibly important since it's so spread out that if you have to follow 18 accounts, then that's extremely difficult, right?
Do you want to repeat the Instagram page? Queers at Queens?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. So it's like at queers, so QUEERS at AT and then Queens. And that's on Instagram. And we actually just hit 100 followers like 2 days
Ooh,
ago. I think
congrats.
we started like 2 weeks or 1 week ago. I can't quite remember. So obviously it's something that people are very interested in and very passionate and hoping to learn more about. So very happy to be putting this forward and hopefully growing it to more of a community at the end of the day. The vision for next year actually is to have sort of like weekly event or something through Queers at Queens. So for example, having an event with alcohol, beers with queers, every Thursday would be something super fun for everyone. And of course, drinking is optional, and we can make sure to enforce that as well, making sure that it's a safe space for everyone, regardless of whether or not you drink or not, and also ensuring that the space is very accessible to those who are disabled. And ultimately, fostering a sense of community, I think, is super important. Putting on these sorts of events, having some sort of consistency so that word gets around and there's some sense of community because there are events that people go to very consistently. I would love to also talk more about transparency as well when it comes to doing equity work and hear kind of your thoughts on it, because I've realized that in my position as co-chair for Q Plus that if you're not communicating what you're doing to everyone, you might not actually be doing enough of the work. And what I mean by that is if you're not telling people that you're doing it, and someone else works on that same initiative, you're kind of doubling the effort and tiring everyone out. Um, and when instead you could be collaborating and pushing for the same mission. There's always strength in numbers, right? So I'm
Yeah,
curious, and like in your experience, like have you noticed anything in regards to transparency around equity work?
yeah. I mean, the first bit of I think transparency needed is that like I know a lot of people coming in don't really know what equity work is,
Mhm.
and especially like international students, for example, where there isn't really much equity work done. For example, where I did my undergrad, and when you were, I think like it would be really beneficial to first of all like know that what specifically equity work is, and as you said, like who is doing what, because like it's really hard to follow. And I absolutely agree with you. Like if people don't really know what is being done, what resources they have access to, like do they really have access to those resources? Do they really have access to those events if like the information can't get to them? And this is always a challenge, I think. Like I do think like if people had a better idea of like what was happening, and clubs absolutely could like collaborate a lot better. Like instead of like events run by like 5 different queer clubs separately, I mean having people band together resources and manpower and kind of sort of like creating these like much bigger events. I think that would really change the space in a way that hasn't been done. Like now, sort of all queer events sort of happen in their little respective corners. I mean that's still fine. I mean that's the route I think to getting to what you mentioned. I know it doesn't happen in a day, and the work you're doing is sort of like all a part to what's going to lead up to it. But it's definitely that should be I think the end goal,
And
right?
that's part of the work that hopefully Queers at Queens can help achieve. It's centralizing that 100%.
Yep.
And also, I think, when
Yep.
it comes to other clubs who are outside of the queer space, when it comes to things like introducing yourself with your pronouns, having an event, and having auto transcription turned on, regardless of whether or not someone there is hard of hearing. So I think you have to be very intentional about
Yep.
the things that you implement, and especially for club leaders, that's something that they really need to prioritize. It's making sure that these things are in place. And I can bet you that probably 95% of, or actually maybe 90% of the Queen's population don't know what the procedures are when it comes to if you've experienced a sexual assault or if you've
Yep.
experienced harassment. It's making sure that all of this
Yep.
is communicated and that people understand the procedures can really help enforce a culture that is less fratty, less, but that's a poor choice of word,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
No, I like the choice
less
of words.
a culture that isn't tolerant towards um, misconduct like sexual assault and etc. So you have to be
Yes.
very
Yeah.
intentional about the way the policies and the things that you implement, and also making sure you're communicating that. And I think lastly, my last point on top.
Before we
Yeah.
maybe move on, I just maybe want to interject one thing. Like, do you feel like some sort of mandatory training that like all students or have to attend, for example, would really help in this regard? Because I know like you, for example, mentioned like how certain common practices are like introducing yourself with the pronouns, but I feel like those practices aren't really universal across Queens. For example, I think in the grad space in computing, it's much less so than I think other spaces I've been in. So I do feel like having like mandatory training would really help to sort of solve that issue, and also like get people educated about the things you mentioned, like letting people know where they can access like what they can do in the event of a sexual assault, like what resources do they have?
Yeah, for sure. That is a really good question because that's been brought up a lot in the commerce society. And especially what I've noticed with training is that it simply isn't going to work if the people aren't engaged in it. And so an
Right.
alternative that I suggest is something like case-based training. That's very, very much more applicable. And I want to give credits to Mina Wasim for this idea. I saw her implemented 2 years ago in the Commerce Society when I first became a co-chair, and I had to go through that case-based training. And essentially what case-based training is, you present a case to a group of people, you allow them to discuss it, and then you come grab back as a group and allow the facilitator to kind of provide a solution to that case. So something that we talked about in that case-based training session was, if someone experienced sexual assault at a conference and they approached you, what would you do as co-chair? So those scenarios I think are really important to experience and also think about, so you preemptively know what to do when, if it ever does arise. I think that's what is really important about training, is that it has to be very applicable. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
theory, I think, when it comes to training, and I don't think that works or engages people because it's just a lot of information that's being spat at
Yeah.
them, and they kind of have to, memorize it. But with case-based training, you're really applying that, thinking of a scenario that might happen to you in a position. So, for students, a case might be like, you see your friend crying in a corner and they tell you that they experienced some sort of sexual assault. What do you do in the situation? To all incoming Queen students, like, or for example, really telling people the importance of introducing themselves with their pronouns and how that fosters a sense of inclusion for people who don't use pronouns like he, him, she, her, is also really important. I think the majority of Gen Zers and also, those growing up are very much acceptable of
Yeah.
being people who are queer. And so it's informing them about why they're doing something and also making it easily applicable with, case-based things. That's what I think would be a great solution.
That's a fantastic idea. Really, so much work being done in the pedagogical way of version, like way of looking at how to get this information to people. And I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, training that's just very by the books and very, don't want to say like uh tokenistic, like, it probably isn't really going to make a big difference. Like, the training has to be very deliberate and very targeted at what issues it's trying to sort of solve, and I think that would probably have the biggest impact. And again, like, I guess we also have to come back to the same issue, right? Like, you need, I think, proper funding for people doing this sort of training to really be able to, like, invest their time and resources into providing the best training possible.
For sure. And on top of burnout and facing a lot of pushback, that's a very
Hmm.
challenging space to be in. And
Yeah.
it definitely feels like your efforts aren't always appreciated. And, when June comes around, if you're a queer club, you're always reached out to
Yeah.
and asked to collaborate or, share a queer event that they're putting on. But then for the rest of the year, you're really never talked about or,
Yeah.
supported intentionally in any way unless you reach out first. I think, especially for the AMS and ComSoc and the Engineering Society and also any other societies that manage clubs or overlook clubs, it's very important to make sure that they're all supported, especially
Yeah.
equity-seeking clubs. And I would love to kind of ask you as well, in your experience, seeing what clubs like Queers in AI have done and also your research as well. I remember you touched on the point of the ethics when it comes to artificial intelligence and some of the challenges
Yep. Yep.
there as well,
Mhm.
that kind of showcases the bias that can often
Technology.
come to be.
Yep.
Would love to hear about that.
So I'll try to keep this like as like, high level as possible. Like, I just mainly what I'm researching is how bias and unfairness sort of creeps into AI technology. So one very famous research paper in this space was the paper of gender shades. Yeah, the what the authors did in that paper was sort of like showing that facial recognition technology by some of the leading providers such as IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, how these all are sort of like, they are a lot better at detecting white male faces than dark-skinned female faces. Like more progressively you go into darker skin, and more progressively go into people who are who present as female, you see the performance of these models sort of get worse and worse. And it speaks a lot to the I guess the makeup of the tech industry of being white male dominated. And it also speaks to how a lot of like really simple ethical issues do not really get spotted in computing. um, and a lot of this is challenging because now that people are working in AI, we have to train AI with something, and the training has to come from data from the real world. And more often than not, data from the real world will have represent some sort of bias against people's. One example of that, like I mentioned, how language technologies have bias against non-binary people. It's because language technologies are trained on language in the internet, and as it happens, the internet is pretty transphobic, so it's going to inherently learn a lot of very transphobic language. So it's my research sort of is in this space, and trying to sort of dissect why these problems happen, trying to educate people on like how to prevent issues like this, and just also dissecting like technology out there and figuring out what other problems lay there like undiscovered.
That's super amazing. And the reason I wanted you to share that is because I remember like in our conversation before this podcast, you mentioned this point, and it made me think about how at Queens as well, you see a lot of the issues here are kind of similar to what you're researching on. It's the fact that a lot of the existing infrastructure, the existing data, the existing systems in place right now aren't equipped to support trans folks, non-binary folks, genderqueer folks, queer folks,
Mhm.
everyone who doesn't identify as cishet. And so you have to be um, on top of what's kind of in place, like even more intentional about what you're doing and putting in place, and making sure that you're providing sufficient support for those people who are doing that. And this kind of makes me think about the fact that you have to be very radical, I think,
Mhm.
when you are in the equity space. And that's something that I discussed in my diversity and inclusion class with Kate Robotham, who I love. I don't know if I pronounced her last name right, but Kate is someone who is so amazing and arguably one of the best professors, I would say, yeah, the best professor I've had at Queens, with just the way she brings intersectionality into the class. Given that it's a diversity and inclusion course, has just been so amazing to experience, because I feel like I can actually share my personal experiences and stories in the class, and that's been a game changer to how I feel in the commerce program. And so my point being is that there really needs to be a lot more support in this area, but as well focusing on supporting these uh, equity work folks.
Yeah, look, that's really amazing, and I can totally relate to like how much having somebody like good, a really good professor, really just do what they do best within that space, like how much it can really change and influence in a way, like it's sort of like inspiring. And for me, when especially when I see like so for example, a queer professor really being in the space, and as you said, like you absolutely have to be radical, right? Because like just the, I suppose, the notion of like challenging the status quo is radical enough
Mm-hmm.
to like people who probably don't want that massive change to happen. So like there isn't really much of a choice, I think, like people in the EDI space really have. And I think like the best course of action is to sort of like not to try to like go half and half in the middle and meet people in the middle. I think you should really lean into it and be as radical as possible. And seeing somebody do that, like to me, that's inspiring when I see a professor really, or like somebody existing, and I kind of feel like that, what, I can be there too one day.
Definitely. Having a great professor makes such a big difference, because I think when I look at accommodations, so let's say you experience an extenuating circumstance. I'm not sure if you've had to use this service before, but you have to provide a lot of documentation. A lot of the
Yeah.
time that involves kind of trauma dumping on a counselor, or a therapist to make sure that you can get all of this, the documentation accommodations that you need. And I think I'd love to share something personal here. So in second year, I didn't do so well in my winter term because of some mental challenges. I was at home. I was dealing with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of a swing of depression here and there. And so it really was really hard. And so ultimately, I had to actually go in front of the academic considerations board or some sort. So it was a panel of professors who kind of evaluate whether or not you stay in the commerce program. And because I actually had done so poor that year, which I really didn't, I failed 2 courses, and the rest of the 3 other courses I got A's in. So it was a very striking difference between how I kind of did in those courses. But ultimately, because the rule in commerce is that if you fail 2 courses, you have to go in front of the commerce academic board, and I had to kind of regurgitate my trauma and what I had to go through, so that I could stay in the commerce program. And ultimately, what happened was I dropped the 2 courses. And so, if I had just done that in the first place, I would have never had to go in front of this board and regurgitate my trauma. And so, I think that just kind of showcases the burden that is placed onto students when it comes
Yeah.
to something as simple as accommodations and making sure that your learning is supported. And that definitely was a bit of a traumatic experience for me. But I'm not sure if you have any experience with this, or you've heard of your friends experiences with this. We'll love to hear that.
I can definitely relate. Like I had a very similar experience in my undergrad where
Mhm.
I was getting straight A's for several semesters, and then suddenly I failed my 2 courses in one semester. And it was like just this huge stark difference because I was going through like a ton of mental health problems. And I mean, it's well, that was a different place in Queens, but like I mean, I feel like mental health problems are kind of go hand in hand with being a queer person. Like it's so common
Yeah.
in queer people
Mhm.
that it makes complete sense. Like your whole life is the sort of um battling like society in a way, and battling sort of what you've been told your entire life. And I mean, I've dealt with a ton of depression and anxiety because of that. And I just feel like if having like a somebody queer to really talk to about this stuff, like when seeking accommodation, for example, would really help so much, because like it's really a problem I think every queer person can really relate to. When I came here, I broke my ankle like within a month of arriving into
Oh
Canada. And
no.
on yeah, like on top of like everything else that was going on, like all the other sort of challenges that I faced, like it was a miserable time. It was such a miserable time. And there was one particular accommodation that I got from some of my professors was like just the ability to sit at home and do some of my coursework. But also I was TAing as part of my courses. And I my professor is also queer and very inclusive. And basically, like they made sure that like in the initial recovery there were people who were supporting me, who were kind of like, and there for the classes I missed, there are people who are like covering for me. Like it's so incredible to have, like when you're going through something traumatic, to have support from people that understand. And I think for a university to really create a space for that is really, really important, and not just to create a space that's already built to like pressurize people.
100%. I totally agree with that. And, having those people in your life makes a world of a difference. And I guess one of the last things that I would love for us to talk more about is some of the issues regarding race here at Queens. I think, or racism to be more precise. I think something that I personally was researching a lot when I first chose Queens was the issues surrounding, experiencing racism. And I remember and microaggressions as well, of course, with Stolen by Smith coming up. But I definitely recall it, like, in my first year when I was in my dorm. I think I shared this story with you before, but I was in a common room washing my water bottle, and someone came up to me started a conversation, and at the end they said something along the lines of like, wow, your English is so good, I thought you were an international student. And I think that was definitely like a somewhat triggering experience for me, because someone, judged me based on my experience. And I have to say, I have definitely also been someone who, despite being Asian, a person of color, I've kind of also had that mindset unconsciously, where um, I thought someone or stereotype someone. That's something I have to admit, and something I've been actively addressing. But yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people of color research before coming to Queens. Going on Reddit, seeing all the posts about, how is racism like at Queens? Am I going to find a sense of belonging? I think that is somewhere that I think everything we talked about today would essentially address. It's that people don't have to do this research about the fact that whether or not they feel or will feel a sense of belonging here at Queens. And, I think definitely the most people are able to, but for those who aren't, it's important to support them as well.
It's sort of a reality here that,
Mhm.
microaggressions are a thing that like people of color here in Canada have to deal with, at Queens they have to deal with. And I mean, I'm happy to say that certain spaces in Queens have been really good about this, but then I've also had like a lot of pretty, as I say, experiences.
Yeah, I think ultimately at the end of the day, we're all people, we make mistakes.
Yeah.
And I definitely have noticed a lot of, criticism on, social media whenever something happens,
Yep.
um, which I think for us to really move forward with a lot of the things that we hope to accomplish, there kind of needs to be a bit more empathy, I think, when it comes to, understanding that these people make these mistakes, and
Yeah.
helping them fix that, um,
Absolutely.
but
I
also
mean,
not for
not
free.
everything is like malicious, I mean,
Yeah.
it's we obviously understand that, and a lot of people are just uninformed, and the
Mhm.
solution to people being uninformed is like the things that you've been mentioning this entire time, like getting people informed, getting people educated on these things is really what's, I think, important, right?
Totally. And to kind of end it off, I guess, I feel pretty optimistic when it comes to Queens. I think a lot of the people who are here and the incoming classes are very diverse. And I think they're really the people who are going to change um, the space. So I feel very optimistic.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. I mean, there are I mean, for almost all the negatives that I've said, I've like at least at Queens there has been so many positives that I truly am very optimistic at, like how I suppose the university experience will be for queer people like 1 to 2 years from now. I think like people are going to experience the fruits of your labor, and like other equity groups in Queens. And yeah, I definitely think the future is bright and colorful and rainbow.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Shift podcast. If you have stories that you'd like to share on the Shift podcast about your experience at Queens, or have questions or comments in general, email studentexperiencessurvey@queensu.ca. Join us next week for another episode of the Shift podcast.